What if the smallest act of kindness could lead to the most extraordinary twist of fate? A homeless man saves a starving dog from certain death, but weeks later, something happens that will leave you speechless. 3 black SUVs pull up at his tent. Who are they, and why are they here? Stay with us to uncover the heartwarming and unbelievable truth behind this incredible story. Before we dive into this moving story, take a moment to comment below where you're watching from today. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that will stay with you long after they're told. Michael, 68 years old but weathered far beyond his years, stretched his aching limbs as the first light of dawn seeped through the frayed fabric of his tent. His body groaned in protest, a reminder of the hard ground he had slept on. The faint rustle of plastic bags and the scurrying of rats told him the city was waking up. It was another day, another battle for survival. Michael's tent, made from mismatched tarps and old cardboard, stood in a shadowed corner where the park's edge met the concrete jungle. He pulled a threadbare blanket around his shoulders, trying to stave off the crisp morning chill. His dark skin bore the etched lines of a life once full of promise, but now overshadowed by hardship. His salt-and-peppered beard was tangled, his clothes wrinkled and stained, a testament to years of neglect. Years ago, Michael's life had been different. He had been a skilled carpenter, his hands creating beautiful things out of rough wood. He had a modest home, a loving wife named Clara, and a bright-eyed daughter Lily, who loved to watch him work in his shop. But tragedy has a way of striking without warning, and for Michael it came one winter night when a faulty heater sparked a fire. He had been out late finishing a job, eager to get home to his family. By the time he arrived, the flames had already consumed most of the house. The sight of flashing red and blue lights, the acrid smell of smoke, and the anguished shouts of neighbors haunted him still. Clara and Lily were gone before he could even say goodbye. That night, Michael's world collapsed, leaving him adrift in a sea of grief. In the months that followed, he tried to find solace in his work, but the pain was too great. His focus waned, mistakes piled up, and soon his reputation suffered. When the economy dipped, Michael was among the first to be let go. Without work, his savings dwindled. Depression crept in, clouding his judgment. Bills went unpaid, and before he knew it, his home was gone. Homelessness came quickly, sweeping him into a relentless current of despair. The man who had once built homes for others now wandered the streets, searching for scraps to survive. His days blurred into a monotonous cycle of hunger, exhaustion, and the stinging judgment of strangers' eyes. As Michael emerged from his tent, he scanned the surroundings. The park was already alive with joggers and dog walkers, most of whom avoided his gaze. His stomach rumbled, a sharp reminder of the meager dinner he had scrounged from a nearby diner's trash the night before. He picked up his few possessions, an old backpack, a water bottle, and a faded photograph of his wife and daughter tucked safely inside a tattered notebook. He made his way to his usual spot near a busy intersection. The sidewalk bustled with commuters, their polished shoes clicking against the pavement, their coffee cups steaming in the crisp morning air. Michael sat on the cold ground and propped his cardboard sign against his knees. It read, "Hungry and homeless. Any help appreciated. God bless." The hours dragged on as Michael watched the world move past him, a blur of indifference. Most people ignored him, their eyes fixed on their phones or the horizon ahead. A few glanced his way, only to quickly avert their gaze. Occasionally, someone dropped a few coins into his cup, their pity as fleeting as the clink of metal on plastic. Michael couldn't help but notice the disparities around him. A few blocks away, another homeless man, a white man, dressed just as raggedly as Michael, seemed to fare better. His cup filled steadily throughout the day while Michael's remained nearly empty. The bitterness crept in, uninvited but familiar. He reminded himself it wasn't worth dwelling on, but the sting of it stayed with him. By midday, hunger gnawed at his insides. He ventured to a nearby dumpster, hoping to find a discarded sandwich or a half-eaten meal. As he rifled through the trash, the aroma of roasted meat and fresh bread filled his senses. cruel reminders of a life he had once known. His hands closed around a bruised apple, and he ate it quickly, savoring its tartness despite its soft spots. The streets were unforgiving. Teenagers shouted insults as they passed, mocking his appearance. Once a group of them tossed a soda can in his direction, laughing as it spilled sticky liquid at his feet. Michael said nothing. Over time, he had learned that silence was safer than confrontation. In the evenings, as the bustling city quieted, Michael often sat outside his tent with his notebook in hand. Inside was the photograph of Clara and Lily, their smiles forever frozen in a moment of happiness. His rough fingers traced the edges of the picture as memories of family dinners, bedtime stories, and backyard games flooded his mind. "I'm sorry," he would whisper, his voice cracking under the weight of his emotions. "I'm sorry I couldn't protect you." The city's nighttime sounds, the distant wail of sirens, the hum of traffic, the occasional shout, provided a somber symphony to his grief. Despite the crushing weight of his circumstances, a tiny ember of hope flickered within him. Maybe tomorrow would be different. Maybe he would find something, anything, that could make his life just a little better. Little did Michael know, his life was about to change in a way he could never have imagined. A chance encounter with a stray dog, a creature as lost and broken as he was, would set in motion a series of events that would shake the foundations of his existence and offer him a chance at redemption. The evening sun cast a deep orange glow over the city, painting the grimy alleyways in fleeting warmth before sinking behind the skyline. Michael Carter trudged down the back streets, his eyes scanning the ground for anything that might pass as dinner. Hunger was a familiar companion by now, gnawing at his insides, but he had learned to live with it. Tonight, like most nights, he hoped the dumpster behind a nearby diner might hold some forgotten scraps. As he approached, the air was thick with the scent of grilled meat and spices. Michael's stomach growled, his pace quickening. The dumpster's lid creaked as he lifted it, revealing a mix of discarded food and packaging. He rifled through it, careful to avoid the sharp edges of broken glass. His fingers closed around a half-eaten burger, still wrapped in its paper, and a faint smile tugged at his lips. Just as he was about to bite into the burger, a sound stopped him. A faint whimpering, almost inaudible over the distant hum of traffic. Michael froze, straining to hear. There it was again, a soft, desperate cry, coming from somewhere deeper in the alley. Curiosity and caution warred within him. After years on the streets, he had learned that unexpected sounds often spelled trouble, but this sound was different. Pained and pleading, pulling at something deep within him. Against his better judgment, he moved toward the noise. The alley was dimly lit, the glow of a flickering street lamp barely piercing the shadows. Michael's footsteps echoed softly as he made his way past piles of trash and discarded cardboard. In the far corner, behind a rusty garbage can, he spotted movement. He squinted, his eyes adjusting to the darkness, and what he saw made his heart clench. A dog, thin and trembling, lay curled up on the cold concrete. Its ribs jutted out painfully, its matted fur caked with dirt and dried blood. One of its paws was twisted at an unnatural angle, the injury clearly old but never treated. The dog's eyes, wide and glassy with fear, met Michael's. They were the eyes of a creature that had known nothing but suffering. Michael hesitated, his mind racing. The dog could be dangerous. Hungry animals often were, and he had no way to defend himself if it attacked. Besides, what could he possibly do for it? He could barely feed himself, let alone care for an injured stray. He took a step back, intending to leave. But the dog whimpered again, a sound so raw and pitiful it stopped him in his tracks. Those eyes, so full of pain and desperation, pierced through his hardened exterior, stirring something he thought he had lost. Compassion. Michael knelt down slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "Hey, buddy," he said softly, his voice gravelly from disuse. The dog flinched but didn't move away, its gaze locked on the burger in Michael's hand. With a sigh, Michael tore off a piece of the burger and held it out. "Here," he murmured. "You look like you need this more than I do." The dog's nose twitched, catching the scent of the food. It hesitated, its body trembling with both hunger and fear, before inching forward cautiously. Its movements were slow and deliberate, each step filled with uncertainty. When it was close enough, it darted its head forward, snatching the food from Michael's hand before retreating a few steps. Michael watched as the dog devoured the morsel in seconds, licking its chops before looking up at him again. There was a flicker of trust in its eyes now, faint but unmistakable. Encouraged, Michael broke off another piece of the burger and offered it. This time, the dog approached more quickly, taking the food gently from his hand. "You're all skin and bones," Michael said, his tone soft as he reached out a tentative hand. The dog flinched at first, but didn't pull away as Michael's fingers brushed against its matted fur. It was coarse and filthy, but beneath the grime he could feel the rapid thump of its heartbeat. "You're a tough little guy, huh?" he said, scratching behind the dog's ears. For the first time in what felt like years, Michael smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile. He sat back on his heels, studying the dog. "Can't just call you dog," he muttered. "You need a name." He thought for a moment, his gaze falling on the dog's tail, which wagged tentatively for the first time. "How about Buddy? That work for you?" The dog tilted its head, as if considering the name before giving a soft whine. Michael chuckled. "Buddy, it is." Michael stood, wincing as his knees protested the movement, and glanced back toward his tent. "All right, Buddy," he said, gesturing for the dog to follow. "Come on, let's get you somewhere warmer." Buddy hesitated, his injured paw making it difficult to walk, but he limped after Michael. Together they made their way through the dimly lit streets, a man and his newfound companion. Back at the tent, Michael laid out an old blanket for Buddy to rest on. The dog collapsed onto it with a heavy sigh, his body finally relaxing after what must have been days, if not weeks, of relentless struggle. Michael rummaged through his backpack, finding a half-empty water bottle, which he poured into a small dish for Buddy. The dog lapped it up eagerly, his tail thumping against the ground in gratitude. For the first time in years, Michael didn't feel completely alone. As he watched Buddy drift off to sleep, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm, a sense of warmth spread through him. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. Purpose. That night, Michael lay on his thin sleeping bag, listening to Buddy's soft snores. The cold still bit at his skin, the sounds of the city still echoed in the distance. But something had shifted. The loneliness that had weighed so heavily on him seemed just a little lighter. "Good night, Buddy," he whispered, his hand resting on the dog's bony back. For the first time in years, Michael dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. The days that followed Buddy's arrival were different. Michael's routine, previously a monotonous grind of scavenging, begging, and surviving, now included the well-being of his newfound companion. Every action, every decision was taken with Buddy in mind. "Come on, boy," Michael said one morning as he tied the makeshift leash he had fashioned from an old shoelace to Buddy's collar. "Let's see what we can scrape together today." Buddy limped beside him, his injured paw still tender but showing signs of slow improvement. The two walked the streets together, their bond growing stronger with each step. Michael found himself paying closer attention to the world around him, where food might be more plentiful, where the shade might provide relief from the relentless sun. He became resourceful in ways he hadn't needed to be before, prioritizing Buddy's needs over his own. Behind a bakery one afternoon, Michael discovered a bag of discarded bread rolls. Though stale, they were edible. He broke one in half, offering the larger piece to Buddy. The dog sniffed it cautiously before devouring it, his tail wagging in gratitude. Michael couldn't help but smile. "You're eating better than I am," he teased, his voice light with a humor he hadn't felt in years. Buddy responded with a soft bark, his brown eyes shining with a trust that made Michael's chest tighten. He hadn't realized how much he had missed this. A sense of companionship, of being needed. Despite their harsh reality, there were moments of joy. Michael would sit in the park with Buddy by his side, watching the world go by. Sometimes, Buddy would chase a plastic bottle Michael tossed for him, his injured paw not slowing him down as much as it once did. The sight of the dog's wagging tail and enthusiastic leaps brought a rare laugh from Michael's lips, a sound so unfamiliar he startled himself the first time it escaped. In the evenings, Michael would talk to Buddy as they settled into the tent. "You know," he began one night, his voice low and thoughtful, "I used to have a family. A wife, Clara, and a little girl, Lily. You would have liked Lily. She loved animals, always bringing home strays, much to Clara's dismay." Buddy's ears perked up, as if he understood, and he rested his head on Michael's lap. Michael stroked the dog's fur, his hand pausing occasionally as he got lost in the memories. "I don't know if I ever told them enough how much they meant to me," he said, his voice cracking. I guess I thought I had all the time in the world." Buddy's tail thumped softly against the ground, a quiet reassurance in the face of Michael's guilt. For the first time in years, Michael found it easier to speak about his past, the weight of his grief lessened by Buddy's steady presence. Of course, life on the streets remained unforgiving. The sight of a homeless man with a dog was met with disdain by some, their judgments sharp and unkind. One morning, as Michael and Buddy sat near a busy intersection, a well-dressed woman approached. Her eyes lit up at the sight of Buddy. "Oh, what a sweet dog!" she exclaimed, reaching out to pet him. Buddy wagged his tail, leaning into her touch. But when her gaze shifted to Michael, her expression hardened. She straightened, clutching her purse closer. "You really shouldn't keep a dog if you can't afford to take care of it," she said, her tone laced with disapproval. Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the pavement. Michael's jaw tightened, his fists clenching. He glanced down at Buddy, who looked up at him with trusting eyes. "It's okay, boy," he muttered, more to himself than to the dog. "We don't need her." Another time a group of teenagers approached, their laughter echoing down the street. Michael's stomach sank as he recognized the cruel glint in their eyes. "Nice dog," one of them said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Bet you're feeding him scraps from dumpsters, huh?" Before Michael could respond, another boy picked up a small rock and threw it in Buddy's direction. It missed, but the intent was clear. Buddy yelped and scrambled behind Michael, who stood protectively between the dog and the teens. "Get out of here!" Michael shouted, his voice filled with a rare anger. The teenagers laughed, but eventually moved on, their taunts fading into the distance. Michael crouched down beside Buddy, his hands shaking as he stroked the dog's fur. "Don't listen to them," he said softly. "They don't know us." Despite the cruelty they faced, Buddy's presence gave Michael a renewed sense of purpose. The dog relied on him, needed him in a way no one had in years. For every harsh word or unkind action, there was the quiet comfort of Buddy's wagging tail, the warmth of his body curled against Michael's side at night. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Michael watched Buddy chase a piece of crumpled paper across the park. The dog's limp was less pronounced now, his coat beginning to regain some of its sheen. Watching Buddy's resilience, Michael felt a flicker of hope. If Buddy could recover, perhaps he could too. Sitting on the cold ground, Michael whispered a quiet promise. "I don't know how we're going to do it, Buddy, but we'll find a way, together." As Buddy trotted back to him, his tail wagging and his eyes alight with joy, Michael felt something he hadn't in years: determination. Together, They would face whatever came their way, no matter how difficult the road ahead. The morning was like any other. The city stirred awake, the distant hum of traffic blending with the occasional honk of impatient drivers. Michael sat just outside his tent, methodically folding the few tattered blankets that shielded him and Buddy from the cold nights. Buddy lay nearby, chewing on a scrap of cardboard, his tail wagging lazily. It was a moment of quiet, a rare respite from the chaos of their daily existence. The faint rumble of engines grew louder, pulling Michael's attention away from his task. He squinted down the street, shielding his eyes from the glare of the sun. What he saw made his breath catch. 3 sleek black SUVs were gliding down the dilapidated street like sharks cutting through water. Their polished surfaces gleamed under the morning light, looking entirely out of place in this neglected part of town. Michael's hands froze, the blanket slipping from his grasp. The vehicles came to a slow, deliberate stop just a few yards from Michael's tent. The air grew heavy with tension, the usual city noises fading into the background. Michael's mind raced. Wealthy people, or anyone driving cars like these, never ventured into this part of the city unless they had a reason, and it was rarely a good one. Buddy sensed Michael's unease and lifted his head, his ears perking up. A low growl rumbled in the dog's throat as the doors of the lead SUV opened. The first to step out was a man in a tailored black suit, his presence commanding and intimidating. He adjusted his tie, scanning the area with a calculating gaze before his eyes landed on Michael and Buddy. More men followed, similarly dressed and moving with the precision of bodyguards. Their stern faces and purposeful strides made Michael's stomach churn. Buddy stood, placing himself protectively in front of Michael. Michael instinctively rested a hand on the dog's head, as much to comfort himself as to calm Buddy. "Stay close, boy," he murmured. The suited man leading the group approached, his polished shoes crunching softly against the gravel. His posture was rigid, his face unreadable. Michael felt the weight of his gaze, a mix of curiosity and scrutiny that made him feel exposed. "Michael Carter?" the man asked, his voice deep and authoritative. Michael's throat tightened. How did this stranger know his name? He nodded cautiously, his fingers curling into Buddy's fur. The man's eyes shifted to Buddy. "That dog," he said, gesturing with a sharp nod. "Where did you get him?" Michael instinctively pulled Buddy closer, his body tense with a mixture of fear and confusion. "Why?" he asked, his voice wary. "What's this about?" The man stepped closer, his expression hardening. "The dog! Where did you find him?" Michael straightened, his pulse quickening. He was in an alley, starving and hurt. "I took him in. What's this about?" The man ignored Michael's question, turning to one of the others and gesturing toward Buddy. Another man approached, holding a tablet. He tapped the screen a few times before holding it out toward Michael. On the screen was a photo of a dog that looked exactly like Buddy. Same soulful brown eyes, same unique markings. Michael's stomach dropped as he realized this wasn't a coincidence. "That's him, isn't it?" the suited man pressed. "This is Buddy, or rather, Max. He's a service dog that's been missing for weeks." "Max?" Michael echoed, shaking his head. "No, this is Buddy. I found him. He was barely alive." The man's lips thinned into a tight line. "He belongs to the Calloway family. The dog went missing after a car accident. They've been searching for him ever since." Michael's heart sank as the man continued. "We've traced him here. The Calloways want their dog back." Michael felt like the air had been knocked out of him. He looked down at Buddy. His Buddy, who had given him hope and purpose over the past few weeks. "You've got it wrong," Michael said, his voice shaking. He wasn't with any family when I found him. He was abandoned, starving. I saved him." The man's gaze hardened. "We're not accusing you of theft, Mr. Carter," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But the dog is not yours. He's a highly trained service animal and a valued member of the Calloway family." Michael's grip on Buddy tightened as anger and disbelief swirled inside him. A valued member of their family? He repeated bitterly. Then why was he left to die in an alley? Circumstances don't matter, the man replied coldly. What matters is that he belongs to them. Buddy pressed closer to Michael, sensing his distress. The dog's loyalty made Michael's chest ache. He looked into Buddy's eyes, those same trusting eyes that had met his in the alley weeks ago. The thought of letting him go felt like losing a part of himself. The man in the suit took a step closer. We're here to retrieve the dog. You can either cooperate or we'll involve law enforcement. Michael's temper flared. Law enforcement? You think I stole him? I've been feeding him, caring for him, keeping him alive. Where were you when he was injured and starving? The man's expression remained unmoved. Mr. Carter, this isn't up for debate. One of the men stepped forward, holding a leash and a collar. Michael's eyes burned as he realized what was about to happen. He knelt down beside Buddy, placing both hands on the dog's face. Buddy, he whispered, his voice cracking, they're saying you belong to someone else. Buddy's tail wagged faintly, as if trying to comfort Michael, unaware of the gravity of the moment. I don't want to let you go, Michael admitted, tears stinging his eyes. But maybe they can give you more than I ever could. Buddy whined, leaning into Michael's touch. For a moment, Michael considered running, grabbing Buddy and disappearing into the maze of city streets. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't work. He couldn't give Buddy the life he deserved while living on the streets. The man with the leash stepped closer, his hand outstretched. Michael hesitated, his entire body trembling. Slowly he stood and placed Buddy's makeshift leash into the man's hand. Buddy resisted, pulling against the stranger's hold and looking back at Michael with wide, confused eyes. It's okay, boy, Michael said, his voice barely a whisper. Go with them. As the men led Buddy away, Michael stood frozen, watching helplessly as his companion, the one bright spot in his life, was loaded into the back of the SUV. Buddy barked once, a sound filled with longing before the door closed. The SUVs pulled away, their engines rumbling softly as they disappeared down the street. Michael sank to the ground, his hands trembling. The ache in his chest was unbearable, as if he had lost a piece of himself. For the first time in years, Michael cried. His sobs echoed in the empty streets, the weight of his loneliness crashing down around him. Buddy was gone, and with him the fragile hope Michael had started to build. The streets felt quieter that night, the usual hum of the city somehow muffled, as if even the world understood Michael's grief. He sat slumped outside his tent, staring at the spot where Buddy had stood just hours ago. The emptiness was suffocating, pressing against his chest like a weight he couldn't lift. The warmth, the companionship, the subtle hope Buddy had brought into his life. It was all gone. Michael's hand instinctively reached for the tattered photograph tucked in his jacket pocket. The edges were worn, the image of Clara and Lily slightly faded from years of wear, but it was all he had left of his family. Now Buddy was gone too, ripped away by circumstances beyond his control. Michael had known the risk from the moment the suited men had stepped out of those SUVs. Deep down, he had known he couldn't keep Buddy. The moment they'd shown him the photograph of the dog they called Max, everything had changed. They spoke of a wealthy family, of a service dog who had been trained to assist and protect. But all Michael could see was the dog who had limped into his life, broken and afraid, just like him. When they offered him money, it felt like an insult. The man in the suit had pulled out an envelope, the crisp edges of $100 bills peeking out. This is a gesture of goodwill, he had said, his tone cold and formal, to compensate you for your efforts. Michael had stared at the envelope, his hands curling into fists at his sides. Did they think Buddy was just a transaction? Something he could sell? His jaw tightened as anger bubbled to the surface. "I don't want your money," Michael had spat, his voice shaking. "He's not something you can buy. I didn't take care of him for a reward." The man's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of impatience in his eyes. "It's not about buying anything," he said evenly. "It's about doing what's best for the dog." Michael's chest tightened at those words. He wanted to argue, to yell that he had done what was best for Buddy when no one else had. But the truth gnawed at him. Could he give Buddy the life he deserved? Could he provide the food, the care, the safety that a dog like Buddy needed? The answer sat heavy in his gut. When it was time to hand Buddy over, Michael had knelt in front of the dog, his hands trembling as they rested on Buddy's face. The dog's tail wagged hesitantly, as if sensing Michael's unease. Buddy's eyes, so full of trust and loyalty, met Michael's, and in that moment, Michael felt his heart break. "You're a good boy, Buddy," Michael whispered, his voice cracking. "The best boy." Buddy let out a soft whine, pressing his head into Michael's hands. Michael stroked the dog's ears, his fingers memorizing every curve and texture, as if trying to hold on to the moment. The thought of losing Buddy felt unbearable, but what choice did he have? "They're going to take good care of you," Michael said, though the words felt like ash in his mouth. "You'll have food, a warm place to sleep, everything I can't give you." Buddy's tail wagged again, this time slower, uncertain. He didn't understand, and that made it all the harder. When one of the suited men approached with a leash, Buddy shifted closer to Michael, pressing against his leg as if seeking reassurance. "It's okay, boy," Michael murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's okay." The man clipped the leash onto Buddy's collar and gently tugged. Buddy resisted, planting his paws firmly on the ground and looking up at Michael with wide, pleading eyes. The sight made Michael's throat tighten, and tears blurred his vision. "Go on," he managed to choke out. "Go with them." Buddy hesitated, his tail tucked low, but eventually he obeyed. As he was led away, he looked back over his shoulder, his gaze locked on Michael until the SUV door closed between them. The rumble of the engines faded into the distance, leaving Michael standing alone on the empty street. His knees buckled, and he sank to the ground, his hands trembling. A sob tore from his chest, raw and unrelenting, echoing into the night. The following days were a blur. Michael went through the motions of survival, scavenging for food, setting up his tent each night, but it all felt hollow. Buddy's absence was like a missing limb, a constant reminder of what he had lost. He avoided the spots where they used to sit together, unable to bear the memories. The sight of other dogs on the street, wagging tails, playful barks, was like a knife to his heart. He found himself scanning the faces of every dog that passed, hoping against hope to see Buddy's familiar eyes, even though he knew it was impossible. The people around him seemed to notice the change. The few who had offered Michael a kind word or a spare coin before now avoided him entirely. His shoulders sagged under the weight of their judgment, their silent accusations that he had somehow failed. He tried not to care, but the loneliness was suffocating. Despite the pain, a small part of Michael clung to the hope that Buddy was safe and happy. He imagined the dog sleeping on a soft bed, eating hearty meals, playing in a backyard, a life far removed from the cold, hard streets they had shared. It was a fragile hope, but it was all he had. One night, as he sat outside his tent, staring at the photograph of Clara and Lily, Michael whispered into the darkness. "I hope you're okay, Buddy," he said, his voice trembling. I hope you're happy." The city offered no reply, just the distant hum of traffic and the occasional wail of a siren. But for the first time in days, Michael felt a flicker of peace. He had done the hardest thing he could do. He had let go, not because he wanted to, but because it was what Buddy needed. As he lay down to sleep, the ache in his chest, still heavy but slightly less suffocating, Michael allowed himself to dream of a better tomorrow, a tomorrow where he might find purpose again, even if it wasn't the same as before. Little did he know, the story wasn't over yet. The next chapter of his life was about to begin, and it would challenge everything he thought he knew about kindness, redemption, and the bonds we share with those we love. The days blurred into weeks, each one as gray and lifeless as the one before. The absence of Buddy left a hollow ache in Michael's chest that refused to fade. He still carried on, scavenging for food, finding quiet corners to rest, but the spark that Buddy had brought to his life was gone. Michael sat outside his tent one evening, staring at the last of his meager dinner, a stale piece of bread and half a bruised apple. He had no appetite, but he forced himself to eat. Hunger didn't stop, even when hope did. The streets around him were unusually quiet, the hum of the city dulled under a heavy blanket of night. He wiped his hands on his worn jeans and glanced toward the park where he and Buddy had once sat together. The memory stabbed at him like a cruel joke. Buddy, chasing an old tennis ball, wagging his tail, curling up beside him at the end of the day. Michael had started talking to the dog as if he were a person, telling him stories of a life long gone. Now, the silence was unbearable. The other homeless individuals in the area began to distance themselves from Michael. Whispers followed him wherever he went. "Ah, sold out that dog," someone muttered as he walked by one morning. Took the money and left the poor thing." Michael's fists clenched, but he didn't respond. He knew the truth, and that had to be enough. Still, the accusations stung. The dog had been his lifeline, his reason to keep going, and now it felt like he had lost everything again. Even the kindness of strangers, rare as it was, had evaporated. People crossed the street to avoid him, their judgment etched on their faces. He tried to keep moving, keep surviving, but his body grew weaker, his will to push forward fading. Nights were the worst, long, cold, and endless. Michael would lie awake, staring at the photograph of Clara and Lily, wondering if he had made the right choice. It was a chilly evening when Michael's world shifted once more. He sat hunched outside his tent, his back against the cold brick wall, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. The faint rumble of engines reached his ears, growing louder by the second. Michael frowned, the sound familiar but misplaced. Then he saw them. The same 3 black SUVs glided down the narrow street, their headlights cutting through the shadows. Michael's pulse quickened, his hands tightening into fists, his mind raced with possibilities. Were they back to accuse him of something else? To humiliate him further? The lead SUV came to a stop a few feet from his tent, and the doors opened. Michael stood slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him. A man stepped out, his suit pristine, but this time his expression was different. There was no cold calculation, no veiled accusation. Instead, his eyes held something Michael hadn't seen before: regret. Before Michael could speak, the familiar sound shattered the tension. A bark! Loud, excited, and unmistakable. "Buddy?" Michael whispered, his voice cracking. Out of the SUV bounded Buddy, his tail wagging furiously as he raced toward Michael. The dog's joy was palpable, his barks echoing in the still night. Michael dropped to his knees just as Buddy reached him, the dog's paws landing on his chest as his tongue lapped at Michael's face. "Buddy!" Michael exclaimed, his arms wrapping around the dog. Tears streamed down his face as he held Buddy close, his fingers running through the dog's now clean fur. "I missed you, boy. I missed you so much." Buddy barked again, his tail wagging so hard it looked like it might fall off. Michael buried his face in the dog's neck, the warmth and familiarity of Buddy's presence washing over him like a balm. "I'm so sorry. Brian dropped PhD in order to become a writer, and so he can't go to college." Michael looked up to see a woman standing a few feet away. She was elegantly dressed, her posture hesitant, but sincere. Behind her stood a teenage girl, her eyes red, as if she'd been crying. Both had the same features, the same striking resemblance to someone who didn't belong in this part of town. "I'm Caroline Calloway," the woman said softly. "This is my daughter, Emily. We're the ones who took Buddy from you." Michael's arms tightened around Buddy instinctively, his grief and anger bubbling to the surface. "What do you want now?" he asked, his voice raw. "Haven't you done enough?" Caroline stepped forward, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "We made a terrible mistake," she said. I thought you had stolen him, but we were wrong." The man in the suit, who had remained silent until now, cleared his throat. "The real story came to light a week ago," he said. "We found out Buddy, Max, escaped after the accident. He was wandering the streets for weeks before you found him." Emily stepped forward, her voice trembling. "You saved him," she said, her eyes meeting Michael's. "You cared for him when no one else would, and I can see now that he loves you." Michael swallowed hard, his hand resting on Buddy's head. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Caroline hesitated, then took another step forward. "To apologize," she said. "To make things right." Michael frowned, unsure of what that meant. The man in the suit spoke again. "We want to offer you a job, a permanent position taking care of Buddy and our other dogs. You'd live on the property, have a place to stay, meals, everything you need to get back on your feet." Michael stared at them, his mind reeling. "Why?" he asked. "Why would you do that for me?" Caroline's eyes softened. "Because you deserve it," she said simply. "Because you gave Buddy something we couldn't during those weeks he was missing, and because we want to help." Emily knelt beside Buddy, scratching behind his ears. "He's been so sad without you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Please, come with us, he needs you, we all do." Michael looked down at Buddy, the dog's eyes filled with trust and love. The thought of leaving the streets, the only life he had known for years, was daunting. But the idea of being with Buddy, of having a chance to start over, was more powerful than his fear. With a trembling hand, Michael nodded. "Okay," he said, "I'll do it." Buddy barked excitedly, his tail wagging as if he understood every word. Emily grinned, and even Caroline's stoic expression softened into a smile. The man in the suit extended a hand. "We'll take care of everything," he said. "Come on, let's get you home." As Michael stood, Buddy pressed against his side, his presence a steady reminder of the bond they shared. For the first time in years, Michael felt a flicker of hope. Real, tangible hope. He glanced at the Calloways, their smiles genuine, their gestures sincere. And for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things were about to change for the better. The apartment was small but cozy, nestled behind the Calloway family's sprawling estate. The first time Michael stepped inside, he felt like an intruder. The walls were freshly painted in soft cream tones, and the scent of polished wood floors greeted him as he set down his single tattered duffel bag. A neatly made bed with a blue comforter sat in the corner, and on the table rested a note. "Welcome home, Michael. We're glad you're here." It had been years since Michael had a place to call his own. The thought brought a lump to his throat. He glanced down at Buddy, who stood by his side, tail wagging, as if sensing Michael's hesitation. "Well, boy," Michael murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "Looks like this is home now." Buddy barked softly, nudging Michael's hand as if to reassure him. The days that followed were surreal. Michael was no longer wandering the streets or scavenging for food. Instead, he woke each morning in his little apartment, the sunlight filtering through clean windows. Buddy was always the first to greet him, his wagging tail a constant reminder of the bond that had brought them here. Michael's new job as a caretaker for the Calloway family's animals quickly filled his days with purpose. He spent hours tending to the dogs, ensuring they were fed, groomed, and exercised. The Callaways owned several dogs, each with their own quirks and personalities, but none bonded with Michael quite like Buddy. The dog followed him everywhere, his devotion unshakable. On his third day, Caroline Callaway approached him in the garden. "We've been thinking," she began, gesturing toward a row of aging kennels near the edge of the property. "These kennels could use some work. Emily said you're good with your hands. Do you think you could repair them?" Michael hesitated, his fingers brushing against the rough wood of one of the kennels. He hadn't done carpentry in years, not since he lost Clara and Lily. The tools felt foreign in his hands at first, but as he sanded, measured, and rebuilt the kennels, a sense of familiarity returned. The rhythm of the work was soothing, a reminder of who he had once been. Soon Michael began tackling other projects around the property. He repaired fences, built a sturdy doghouse for Buddy, and even crafted a small birdhouse for Emily. Each finished piece filled him with quiet pride, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. With steady work and a safe place to sleep, Michael started to believe in the possibility of a better future. The Callaways encouraged him to take the next steps toward rebuilding his life, and he began reconnecting with social services. For the first time in years, he felt more like a person than a shadow in the city's margins. One afternoon, Caroline handed him a pamphlet for a local counseling center. "They helped me after the accident," she said, her voice soft. "I think they could help you, too." Michael stared at the pamphlet for a long moment before nodding. "Thank you," he said quietly. The sessions were difficult at first, talking about his past, about Clara and Lily, about the fire, and the years of pain that followed, felt like reopening old wounds. But the counselor was patient, guiding Michael through his grief and helping him envision a future he thought was out of reach. Slowly, Michael began to heal. His posture straightened, his steps grew more confident, and the weight of his past no longer felt so suffocating. He even began volunteering at a local shelter, helping others who were struggling as he once had. "You've been there," one man said to him one evening, his voice tinged with gratitude. "You know what it's like. That makes all the difference." Michael smiled, his hands resting on Buddy's head. "Yeah," he said softly. "I do." Throughout it all, Buddy remained Michael's steadfast companion. The dog's presence was a constant source of comfort and joy, grounding Michael on even the hardest days. Buddy seemed to thrive in their new environment, his once matted coat now sleek and shiny, his injured paw fully healed, but his loyalty to Michael never wavered. Every morning, Buddy followed Michael to the kennels, wagging his tail as Michael worked. Every evening, the two of them sat on the porch of the apartment, watching the sunset over the Callaway estate. Michael often found himself talking to Buddy, his voice light with gratitude. "You saved me, you know," Michael said one evening, scratching behind Buddy's ears. "I thought I was saving you, but it was the other way around." Buddy thumped his tail against the porch, his eyes fixed on Michael with unwavering trust. Their bond was unshakable, a testament to the resilience of both man and dog. They had pulled each other back from the brink, and now, together, they were building a new life. As the months passed, Michael's life continued to transform. The Callaways treated him with respect and kindness, inviting him to family dinners and including him in their lives. Emily, who had been so hesitant around him at first, now sought him out to talk about school, her friends, and her dreams of becoming a veterinarian. "You're part of the family now," Caroline said one evening as they sat around the dining table. Her words warmed Michael in a way he hadn't felt in years. For the first time, Michael allowed himself to dream again. He thought about saving up to buy a small woodworking shop, a place where he could craft furniture and share his skills with others. He thought about staying in touch with the people at the shelter, offering them the same kindness and understanding that had been shown to him. But most of all, he thought about Buddy, the dog who had given him the strength to keep going. Their journey had been full of hardship and loss, but it had brought them here, to a place of healing and hope. One evening, as Michael sat on the porch with Buddy at his feet, he gazed out at the sprawling fields of the Callaway estate. The air was cool, the sky streaked with the warm hues of a setting sun. He reached down to scratch Buddy's head, smiling as the dog leaned into his touch. "We made it, Buddy," he said softly. "We finally made it." Buddy wagged his tail, his eyes fixed on Michael with the same loyalty and love that had saved them both. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. Michael's life was no longer defined by loss or despair. It was a life filled with purpose, connection, and a bond that could never be broken. And in the quiet moments as the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Michael allowed himself to believe in something he hadn't dared to in years: a brighter tomorrow. The gentle hum of crickets filled the air as Michael sat on the porch of his small apartment, Buddy lying contentedly at his feet. The night sky stretched out above him, the stars brighter here than they ever were in the city streets he used to call home. A cool breeze rustled the leaves of the nearby trees, and for the first time in years, Michael felt at peace. He looked down at Buddy, who was snoring softly, his tail twitching as if he were chasing something in his dreams. Michael smiled, his fingers brushing against the dog's fur. It was hard. As he leaned back in his chair, Michael allowed his mind to wander, revisiting the path that had brought him here. It was a journey filled with heartbreak and struggle, moments of despair that had threatened to consume him. Yet, within the darkest of times, there had been glimmers of light. He thought of the cold nights spent on the streets, his only shelter a flimsy tent or an abandoned doorway, the hunger, the judgmental stares, the whispers of those who passed by. Those memories still lingered, etched into his being. But alongside them were the small acts of kindness that had kept him going. A cup of coffee handed to him by a stranger, a diner owner who let him sit inside for a few minutes to escape the biting wind. And then there was Buddy. Buddy had entered his life when Michael least expected it, a scrawny, injured stray who had needed him as much as he had needed the dog. Saving Buddy had given him a purpose when he had none. Feeding him, caring for him, and simply being there for him had reminded Michael of the man he used to be, the man he thought he had lost forever. "Funny how life works," Michael murmured, his gaze shifting to the horizon. "I thought I was saving you, Buddy, but you were the one saving me." Michael knew now that finding Buddy wasn't just a coincidence, it was a turning point. That one decision, to share his food with a starving dog, to open his heart when it was so much easier to stay closed, had set off a chain of events that transformed his life. If he hadn't stopped that night in the alley, Buddy might not have survived, and without Buddy, Michael might never have found the strength to keep going. The bond they had formed was more than companionship. It was a reminder of the power of connection, even in the harshest of circumstances. Michael thought about the Callaways, about their initial accusations and the way they had come back to make amends. It wasn't just their apology or the job they offered that mattered. It was the realization that people could change, that even those who made mistakes could choose to do better. As he reflected on his journey, Michael felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the Callaways, but for every person, every moment that had helped him along the way. Even in his lowest moments, there had been slivers of hope, small but powerful enough to keep him moving forward. Michael reached down, scratching Buddy behind the ears as the dog stirred from his nap. Buddy looked up at him, his eyes filled with trust and love, and Michael couldn't help but smile. "We've been through a lot, haven't we?" he said softly. Buddy wagged his tail in response, the familiar rhythm a soothing reminder of how far they had come. Michael's thoughts turned to others who were still out there, struggling as he once had. The faces of the men and women he had met during his time volunteering at the shelter came to mind, each of them carrying their own burdens, each of them searching for a way out. He hoped his story, his journey, could offer them a glimmer of hope. "People think it's impossible sometimes," he said, his voice quiet. "To climb out of that hole, to start over. But it's not. You just need someone to believe in you, someone to remind you that you're worth saving." For Michael, that someone had been Buddy, and now he wanted to be that someone for others. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Michael began to find ways to give back. He spent his mornings caring for the Callaway's animals and his afternoons at the shelter, sharing his story with those who felt invisible and forgotten. "There's a way out," he would tell them, his voice steady and full of conviction. "It's not easy, and it doesn't happen overnight, but it's possible, and you're not alone." Each time he spoke those words, he thought of Buddy. The dog had been his lifeline, his reason to keep going, and now Michael hoped to offer that same lifeline to others, whether it was through a kind word, a hot meal, or simply listening. He wanted to make a difference. As Michael sat on the porch, the stars twinkling above him, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known in years. His journey wasn't over. There were still challenges to face, still days when the weight of his past threatened to drag him down, but he had found something stronger than despair: hope. Buddy nudged his hand with his nose, breaking Michael's reverie. The dog's tail wagged as if to say, "We did it." Michael smiled, his heart full. "Yeah, boy," he said, his voice warm with gratitude. "We did." And in that quiet moment, with Buddy by his side and the world stretching out before him, Michael allowed himself to believe that second chances weren't just possible, they were worth fighting for. To anyone who might stumble across his story, Michael would have one message: look beyond appearances, extend kindness, even when it's not easy. You never know the impact you might have, not just on someone else's life, but on your own. Because sometimes, in saving someone else, you end up saving yourself.